Is it going? Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Academic Yak podcast. We're excited for episode 2 already, if you can even believe that it's already there. I am so excited to have our first guest on. If you watched the first episode, then you will recognize this lovely person who so graciously agreed to host me for the first episode, but now I get to be in my spot and she gets to be in her spot for the podcast. And yeah, I'm gonna let her introduce herself, but thanks for being here. If at any point during the podcast you have any questions, I have the chat open and I would love to hear any questions as we're going along. But yeah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I can. So, my name is Gabrielle. I'm currently a master's student in communication in a southern school. I don't think we're saying like affiliations at this point, which is fine. I lived in Arkansas my whole life, and I went to school for 2 years in Monticello, Arkansas, which is a smaller town, and then eventually moved to a bigger university related to the institution. Um, I'm currently studying rhetoric, focusing on minimalism and class issues and racism. And I'm just really excited. Like, I think that rhetoric is a really privatized institution as a study. So, talking about it in a really accessible way through a podcast, it feels really meaningful, I think, to me, probably because I don't have a lot of content that I can consume in the same fashion.
Yeah, and that is really an ultimate goal of having this podcast exist in general, is just like higher education is really gatekeepy in nature. There's a lot of jargon, there's a lot of gates, if you will, in the way of people who wouldn't normally have access to this kind of content or this kind of conversation. That's the purpose of this existing, is so we can talk about the really cool niche things that we do in the academy and share them in a way that's accessible to everyone else. And so by bringing you on, the reason I wanted to bring you on, one, because you're my friend and I really enjoy just talking to you, but also because you and I both are in a department of communication, and yet we study completely different things in a completely different way. And I think a lot of people hear communication and they think that you are talking on the radio, or you're doing TV interviews, or you are running a company's social media accounts, things like that, which is a really applicable way of using some of the things that we learn. But the way that we're approaching our field is very different. And I think that it's really cool to talk about that, but also to see from the last episode where I was talking about my interest in health communication and how I'm going about that, and then now to hear how you're doing that. I think that people don't understand. Thanks, Dad, for letting us know that the sound quality is great. This is all Nick's changes, but we we study things so differently that it's really good to show people how diverse really this field that we are in is. And so I'm particularly interested in what you study, because we've had a few 30-minute or less conversations that are very blanketed about what it is that you do, but we really haven't had an opportunity to just sit down and talk about what you do and why you want to do it. So let's start with a little bit of background first. So you said you went to a secondly affiliated institution before coming here in your undergrad, and then you graduated from the institution that we're in now and have decided to go to graduate school. So kind of walk me through the process of getting into communication specifically and then making that decision to transition to graduate school.
So, I originally, like, as a teen, I say, because as a child, I, like, wanted to be a chef and a music producer and, all the things that, like, kids want to be. That became really impractical as I became a teenager, and I wanted to be actually an English teacher. I wanted to teach creative writing.
Same.
And I did, like, I did publications my entire high school career. So when I graduated, I was like, oh, well, I'm really interested in doing, like, press law and publication, and I'm interested in understanding that. So I went into communications at this small university where journalism and communication were combined. And at the institution I was in, they were one of the, like, top debate schools, and they had a really great applied speech program, which I was not really interested in, but learned a lot from now in its own frustration. I'm grateful that that's what it was. Um, And then I quickly became interested in power. So, talking about how communication and messages are shared to create institutions that keep people where they are, instill some sort of like dynamic that they cannot combat. So, like capitalism and racism and sexism and all of these like really big nebulous ideas that have now been demonized. That's like the frame through which I exist. And so, when I was beginning to pick what I wanted to do, I knew I wanted to stay in that realm, but I needed job skills. So I went into an institution for internships in the summer of 2019, and actually worked on a federal office of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention,
Mm-hmm.
where I did like the office lady thing, which was not my jam. Like, I loved the work that I was doing. I got to meet a lot of really great people, some of which had saved my own life through my own, experiences with suicidal thoughts and whatever. So it was a really moving experience, but I quickly understood that that was not what I wanted at all.
Yeah.
So I came back. I finished my first, like, I think it might have been my second year is when I started the U of A back after DC.
Yeah.
And then I took a class with a really respected scholar who is a white woman who publishes about Black feelings. And I was really moved by her class.
Yeah.
And so through this process, my partner and I are doing undergrad together, and we're learning and growing, and we're trying to create systemic change in our own community. And I have a crisis about February 20, it would have been 2019, maybe 2020,
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember, where I was like, I have to get something. I have to choose something because I'm about to graduate,
Yeah.
and I cannot enter an office job. And so it became very clear that the only option I had was to go to grad school, because then I could say provocative and controversial things in a really academic way where it creates space and seeks justice, instead of just doing like where I'm from, working in an institution that's like a 500 Forbes 500 or whatever. Like, that's not what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
So I joined the program with that in mind.
Yeah. And I think that like something that you touched on is really good to talk about, and that is the formative nature of having someone like Dr. Lisa Corrigan as a, kind of introduction to this world, because like you said, you were kind of hungry for that sort of systemic understanding and change, and saying like, this is not okay, and I recognize this as a white woman out in the world, that this isn't okay. And even though I'm privileged from this system, I am recognizing that I can also then make formative change in that system. And you've been working adamantly through your time with the suicide prevention group, and with the work just in general, writing about it, talking about it, having discourse about it in and out of the classroom. You've really provided space for people to grow. And I want to say, like, for me, I didn't have a Lisa Corrigan, and I mean, she's here now, and I'm in a program where I have access to her, but we don't have a relationship. And so you are kind of like branching off in your own way from the work that she's doing, inspired by some of the things that she has said and done. And like, you're very different people, and that's totally awesome, because we can't all have the same person over and over again. We need people to approach things in a different way. And I think that she's amazing, she does great work, but she's not approachable for everyone. And I think that you could possibly open a door to be approachable in a new way. And I think that that's really, really important. And I think that you recognizing that ability in yourself and recognizing that that need is there, you've now picked a path that allows you to kind of join those two aspects of your life together in a way that does produce change, even if it's not in some grandiose over the top way, as we see a lot of people in the academy doing. You're it takes little pieces to make a whole puzzle, and I think that you're working really hard to do that. So now that you're in graduate school, knowing that this was the avenue to be able to have those controversial opinions, but have the platform to appropriately do them, and follow them through, talk about what your one, what your experience has been like in the first year, right? We're in a global pandemic. We've also lived through many other historical events in that time frame. We have Black Lives Matter movement that was continuously brought up right before we were starting grad school and has not died down in that push, which is good. We don't want to see that go away unless it's for the right reasons. And then also we have the Stop Asian Hate that's going on right now, and however comfortable you are talking about those things, kind of talk about maybe what that experience has been like for maybe validation purposes of what you're trying to do, and then how that leads into kind of this thesis project that you have going on.
Yeah, so when you come to rhetoric, you quickly learn that it is a white institution that uplifts white voices. Part of why we have a Dr. Lisa Corrigan, and I think that this is a really great thing, is the fact that people will listen to the white woman, and that's not to like objectify her or try to tokenize her, but she has power in the institution as a part of the white, you know, the white structure that gives people power to create. I know some of her personal principles are like she won't speak on a panel unless everyone is paid the same.
Yeah.
Um, and there are a lot of institutions in which that is not a normal practice. Like they won't hold those same standards,
Yeah.
in whatever fashion. And so when I came in, I was largely studying blackness and whiteness and how it creates a dynamic and a power structure. But then living through the Black Lives Matter, kind of, I called it a swell in 2020 with George Floyd's murder and the Black at U arc, which is a project I'm currently working on. And I don't know how much I can disclose about that, but that's a really interesting project to kind of look into if you're interested. Um, Working on all of these institutions and trying to understand that rhetorical structure,
Yeah.
has led me to kind of where I'm at now with my thesis. Granted, it's not inherently about race, although I would argue it is, talking about minimalism and how it is a complete criticism of capitalism, which is fine, but it does it in a way that invalidates class trauma,
Yeah.
and struggles of poorer people, white or brown or black. There are some experiences in which we are all, it's called intersectionality of oppression. And we as white women create, there are intersections in which we are oppressed by. So like we are women, I'm a queer woman, so there's like multiple
Yeah.
intersections where my oppression is impacting me.
Yeah.
But I will never, even in my own oppression, understand or be able to, really truly see the intersections of the experience of Black and brown communities.
Yeah.
So in my own understanding, I'm trying to say like minimalism is a hyper white anti-capitalist moment that was commodified by capitalism through the minimalists, Ryan Nicodemus and Joshua Fields Milburn, and they're now creating institutions of whiteness within this alternative lifestyle.
Yeah. And in an alternative lifestyle that's kind of trying to be something that it's really not, right? Yeah. It's trying to say like fuck capitalism basically, but in doing so, really when I think about people who are minimalists and self-identify as minimalists, like those people have a lot more money than anyone that I know. Like, because the things that they have are like speaking pieces, right? So you have like and correct me if I'm wrong, but when I'm thinking about this, like you have an empty room. If you're going to have just 3 or 4 items in that room, they need to be a showy sort of item. And so when I think about that versus someone whose home is just really tidy, because those are different, when I think about the difference between that, one person is saying like, oh, I just like to keep things tidy and clean, and that's great. And another person is saying like, I have enough money to make this whole space so grandiose it doesn't need a million things to look this specific way. And I think that that's a really interesting light that you're shedding on that, because I really never had thought about it until you mentioned it to me when we first started talking about thesis projects in the fall. So when you're looking at this project and you're saying, okay, I'm being critical of this movement and here are the reasons why, what is the long-term goal of speaking about this movement in this way? And also maybe talk a little bit about like your consideration of PhD programs and how a lot of times this is your foot in the door in kind of a specific direction. So what are the long-term goals of having a master's thesis project about something like minimalism?
Yeah, so the goal, I think for me, and I'm not going to speak for the rhetoric community in general
Yeah.
because this could totally be incorrect. But for me, the goal is not to dismantle the institution of minimalism. I do have an interest in dismantling the system of like blackness and whiteness and its verses, and sexism and discrimination. All of those are institutions I'm interested in dismantling. Minimalism is a counterculture, and so it's not even that I want that to stop. Like, I am also identify as a minimalist.
Yeah.
I've identified as a minimalist since I was in college, like early in college, probably my sophomore year, to the point where I like threw all my shit out and moved everything in like my Trailblazer. Um, my interest, and I think this is the interest of a lot of rhetorical scholars, is to expose the inconsistencies and in the things that were not considered for people that are not white. So I'm thinking about like when I lived in DC, minimalism is a really great thing if you have absolutely no class trauma. So like there are some people in this institution who would have no trouble just throwing all their shit out because one, they can buy it all again.
Yeah.
I was never in that position. I'm still not in that position, even as an incoming scholar studying minimalism.
Especially as an incoming scholar.
But you have, so like think about somebody who has $100 and say something breaks. Is there likelihood to fix it, or is it to just buy another thing? Like,
or just be really broken that thing is gone.
Yeah. So it's like when you don't consider the fact that not everybody has that mobility and that the flexibility and finances to be able to do that, and you want to say like, throw all your shit out. That's the reason you're unhappy. The reason you're unhappy is all of the capitalism and the structures of oppression and the ideas that you are stuck where you are. Those are things that are making you unhappy. But we've now attributed it to all of the things in your home, which is not factual. Like the things in your home, to an extent, bring you comfort, if not cause anxiety. The anxiety is something to talk about with someone who's professional in mental health fashions. Like, and that's kind of where you see the suicide prevention coming in. But then you also see like obsession and obsessive compulsive disorder, which is kind of the antithesis that can flip all of that on its head. You see institutionalizations of minimalism and its effects, and then it's created like a permission structure for minimalism to keep. I'm not going to say minimalism traumatizes people, but it works against them.
It could traumatize people.
Oh, for sure. But it's the institution is not. The intent is good. The attempt is good. The execution is poor.
Yeah.
And that's my critique.
Yeah, and I think too, back on like when minimalism, well, I don't want to say when minimalism first came out because I'm not really sure when that first came out as a movement, if you will. But I think of that show. What is that show called? The one where the woman is like, oh, does it bring you?
Marie Kondo.
Yeah. So it's very cute. The show is very cute, and I do enjoy watching it. But I remember when I first watched a couple of episodes, my husband and I just saw it. And I was like, man, people keep talking about this show. I should probably watch it, figure it out. And I remember feeling really guilty, and I don't like that movement tends to make me feel that way, because it made me really feel like I have too much stuff, and therefore I put too much value on the things that I do have, and I had to take a step back and
My mom.
Yeah, Gabby's mom has. Is that your mom?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, okay. Gabby's mom's joined us and said she will always be her favorite. I wish I was a favorite too, but it's fine. I'll forgive you.
We'll have to meet her first.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of did, but anyway. So when I think about that, I don't like that. Again, this execution has been so poorly done. Not to say that show did it by itself, but like the movement in general does make some people feel like, because I do like having certain things around me in my life, that I'm then hoarding, or that I'm causing my own anxiety, or that I'm causing my own depression because I do place value on the things in my life. And I think that's not fair. And I think that again is where that execution comes into play, because it's like, yeah, the intentions are great. Like, make sure that you're not overspending, that you're not falling victim to a system that is inherently just about taking your money, but also like it's okay to like having things. It's okay to feel successful because you can buy your own computer or to buy your own, you know, fun tapestries and things around your home. So
Well, even think about how, and I know this is a conversation that you and I, and even me and my partner have been having, is what does ableism look like in minimalism? Like the fact that you, and we talked about this in the last podcast, if you're interested, please go listen. ADHD literally impacts every facet. I mean, there are things like I think that are hyper focused that my partner does that encourage like what someone can consider clutter. Like we have so much D&D shit in my house and I love that. But to a minimalist, like that's horrible. That's just the worst thing. And so to me, it's not even like, please own whatever shit you want, please, because it doesn't matter in the long run. You yourself are not going to be able to change global warming or capitalism overall. And this is my like, leave my D&D stuff out of this. My whole assertion as an academic is people deserve to feel content in whatever fashion they like, as long as it is not harming others.
Yeah.
And I think that like collectively, I mean, if you look at low waste, which is a spin out of minimalism, but also inherently connected.
Yeah.
Low waste is talking about how we need to, you know, don't own anything that has plastic, or don't own anything that hurts the turtles. Like, I'm here for that. But I am never going to be able to clean all of the trash out of the ocean on my own.
Yeah.
So if I need, because I have an issue with my hands and I can't grip things, like that does happen. I am a disability scholar as well. Sometimes a plastic straw makes a difference and gives me more accessibility. So like there are facets to everyday life in these institutions that are telling us to be better with no understanding of what better means, and it is extremely one note for what better could be. So for somebody with ADHD or like myself has anxiety and chronic pain, like these structures are not made for us.
Yeah.
And there's a growing number of people that are learning that they're part of this institution of, you know, the institution is somewhat made against us. Creating your own fashions of living through that is what's important.
Yeah, and I think too, like a lot of times people who are operating under this sense of, you know, saving the planet through low waste or reusable items are operating under the assumption that people can upfront the money to have those reusable items. And this is something that I've continuously thought about over specifically the last weekend. I don't know why, but it is just something that's been on my mind, is that, you know, it would be absolutely lovely for me to have reusable Ziploc bags and reusable containers and reusable straw, and all of these things that are inherently better, right? Like a Diva cup or having period underwear or things like that, right? Because we know that tampons and pads have a lot of excessive waste. And so there are all these things that compound that do have a lot of waste, but like it is so much cheaper to be able to go buy a box of tampons than it is to buy period underwear. And I think that that's a really important thing that people don't consider, because they're like, well, in a year's worth of time or in 2 or 3 or 4 years worth of time, then you'll make up that money. But you're operating under the assumption I have that money right now to spend on being eco-friendly or on being accessible. It's the same thing with healthy foods, right? Healthy food is extremely expensive in comparison to like going to McDonald's and getting a couple of burgers and that filling me up versus trying to get all the components to make a good salad, which yes, per serving is cheaper, but they don't sell it in a way that it's per serving. So I think that there's all these things that compound to a lack of recognition of the not able-bodied population, which is like a really significant part of our population, especially here in the US. Like we have a lot of people who are suffering in several ways, and most people it's not just one thing. And movements like the minimalist movement with good intention are saying here are things we can do to better this thing, and they're not considering the class ramifications like you're talking about, or the ableist notes and undertones that come along with that conversation.
Yeah, and I think that for me, the institutions that we live under are really like claustrophobic. I mean, I think that like you can obsess your whole life about the one time you ate McDonald's and threw your plastic straw away, or and that's fine if that's how you choose to like live your
Right.
life.
Yeah.
I am not able to do that, and I know that I'm not alone in that. And so my interest in terms of academics and my institutional place even now is to expose those structures that do not work for disabled people or do not work for women or do not work for non-binary and queer people. I think that all of these fashions, while I mean minimalism in its good intention, like you said, the execution was poor and it has not grown any.
Yeah.
So like even if I were to release a book now about minimalism and I didn't consider queer, black, brown, um, male, any sort of institution that is not normative to my body, it's my job as an academic or as at least a public figure, especially the minimalist as they are, um, they didn't grow any. They didn't
Yeah.
make any more space for people. It was just, you have too much stuff. Here you go. Here's how I escaped my, they call it a gaping void.
Yikes.
And they say it in both documentaries, fun fact. It's like a script. You can read them side by side. But
Hate that.
it's interesting because you can watch minimalism become a capitalist idea.
Yeah.
They've released 5 books. I think they just announced another one. They have a podcast on Patreon where you pay $5 per episode, and they have over 186 episodes the last I checked. And they've made 2 documentaries, not counting any revenue from YouTube or any sort of streaming service that they have partnerships with. You've capitalized on an anti-capitalist movement,
Yeah.
which is extremely ironic and also serves to be critiqued. Like
Yeah.
it's the minimalist movement in its authentication and kind of growth in 2017 was a really interesting time to be online because you also saw the rise of veganism and low waste movement and like the trash jar girl. She only had all her trash from like 10 years in a jar.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's a completely unattainable thing to everyone but you.
And I will say though of that particular person that she has done a good job of backtracking and saying like I understand that this is not something that everyone has the privilege of accessing. And she walks through how she did that. And the entire time that she's made, I think she's done like a whole series on this at this point. But the entire time she's going through that process, she's like, here's what I did, but I understand not everyone can do this. So if you can't, here are some alternatives to working your way towards this and just do your best. And I think that that should be something the minimalist movement should be kind of striving towards because again, it's not that the minimalist movement is bad. It's not that the minimalist movement shouldn't exist or that you shouldn't have things. It's that the execution of that process is in nature a gatekeeping process. And saying like, do this or you're not this. Do this or you're not this. Instead of do this, and if you can't, here are some ways to work towards this, or here are alternatives to fit the different needs of people. Because the other thing is like, I can't tell you how many times I've heard people who are minimalists say things like, you have to be like extremely minimal. You can't have this sort of thing or this many items in this room or whatever. And it's a fixation. And it's like, well, maybe minimalism for me would look very different than it would for you. Like maybe my minimalism is having larger furniture and having a couple of plants around, whereas for you it might be having several pieces of smaller furniture with plants and a couple of like extra little decorative items around. So it's just like it's I want to make it clear because it's really easy when you're being critical of a movement or a system or a process to just say like fuck this process, it's not going well, instead of saying, hey, here is something that is kind of interesting that a lot of people are participating in, but I think we could do a little bit better of a job. And I think that that's your ultimate goal, and correct me again if I'm wrong, of doing this thesis project is to say like, this thing is interesting and it exists in the world whether we want it to or not,
Mhm.
but I want to like be critical of that process. And I think that that's really healthy for human beings in general. Like anytime you're trying to implement a new phase in your life, like being critical of that process and being critical of the things that you're choosing to integrate into your own life on a consistent basis is really healthy.
Yeah, and I think about how people are always searching for answers. This is not like my big soapbox moment, but people are always searching for answers, and things like life gurus, like the minimalists, try to provide that. Like, people are going to be unhappy in states of oppression and capitalism
Yeah.
because that's how it's set up. And that's not a bad thing for you. It doesn't speak to the fact that you're a failure. It doesn't speak to your disabilities causing some sort of impact on your success. Like, that has, you could do nothing. You could do all of the things: marriage, children, job, house, dog, whatever. You could do all of the things. You could
Yeah.
live on normative time and still be unhappy.
Well, and think about how many times even Hollywood has shown us that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like think about the number of times that we consistently see media that is a reflection of society and they're saying like I have the, even just intros to TV shows or movies, and they're like, I lived the perfect life, right? I had the husband, I had the kids, I had the dog, I had the house, I had the white picket fence and the HOA, and I lived in a 5-star school or whatever. And then immediately within that first 15 seconds, it ends with like a car on fire and this
Yeah.
woman's hair is a disaster and she's covered in char, right? Because there's always going to be something that we, as being human beings and inherently finding things to be critical of, are not going to be happy about. And there are always things that we're going to try to be really happy about. And I think that just by, again, being critical of that process and being critical of the things that we choose to surround ourselves with, and just being willing to do the work of having the conversation and contributing to the academic world in this way is really important. And I commend you in that because, like, I can't tell you how many times I've talked to my dad or talked to my husband or my mom or anyone and just said like, yeah, I have this friend Gabby and we're in this program together, and like, well, what do you do and what does she do? And they're like, those are completely different things. And I'm like, yeah, because I would never want to sit down and read about minimalists or read about critical race theory because I would just be depressed all the time. And yeah, maybe I should do better about that, but I think I found like a healthy balance of like what I can handle and making space for people like you to come in and talk about those things and educate us on them a little bit better without being the one that has to be responsible for creating that space. And I just also don't think about the world in that way.
Yeah.
So
I know that we've talked about it in our group chat among our grad student,
the
like
babes.
yeah, we call them babes.
Hey babes, if you're here, thanks for joining us.
Talking about how a rhetorician is trained to see the world like that.
Yeah.
And I do not wish that training on anyone who does not want it. However, I think that some of the things that come out of rhetoric are really useful to everyone.
Yeah.
So to me, and I always joke, like, rhetoric should come with a free therapist, and I stand by like that is a belief that that's a hill I'll die on. I
also,
think.
everyone should probably go to therapy at least once.
Way more than once.
Yeah, at least once.
Capitalism is traumatizing, but I know that for me, it took a lot of time for me to be okay with being uncomfortable. And so thinking about, and this, like, I think back in 2018, I adopted the, like, New Year's resolution of just try to be better, whatever better means. Like, if that means I didn't have a panic attack in the middle of Target, cool. If that means I got rid of 3 bags of clothes that I no longer wear because they make me feel uncomfortable and they don't fit me because I gained 50 pounds in a pandemic or whatever, like, who knows? Which I refuse to shame people for. Be okay with your quarantine weight. Those are things that we have to be ready to face that not everyone is in a place to be receptive to. And so for me, my goals in academia, and I didn't grow up in a household that was like critical of everything. We barely watched movies that were just not, like, we watched the classics, and that was enough, and that's great. And now, I'm watching, what movie did I just watch? Bo Burnham's Inside. And I'm like, there is so much here to talk about and so many underlying commentary. And by the way, if you haven't watched that, it's great. It's kind of a touch into rhetoric in a really approachable way.
Yeah. People think
Yes.
that everything has to be perfect in order to find perfection, and that's false. Yeah, that's really, really important. I think that people really should consider that one, nothing is perfect. And if your only goal in life is to be perfect, you're always going to be disappointed, and you're always going to be frustrated, and you're always going to just probably be angry. I know that that's actually been a really tough thing that I've had to deal with, and we kind of touched on that last podcast. And I know that you had similar instances, but like coming to terms with the fact that like I came into a program with a very specific idea, and I was going to do that thing, and I was going to change the entire fucking world, right? Because that's what they tell us to do if you're going to go to graduate school. And I think in that way, all of us have changed, right? We all had underlying intentions that we have stuck with, which is to do better and to be better. But I think that your mom's right. Like people who are only striving for perfection and think that that's the only way to sort of be successful is really hard. And I think that comes with the capitalist movement a little bit as well. It's just like, it's not about the money. It's not about always making the most money. I think that capitalism as a movement has come with many, many other things that are societal commentaries. And I think that is overrated. Literally the word I was going to say. Yeah, yeah.
My mom is my cheerleader. Like,
She should
truly.
be.
Well, she's the one who's like, have you thought about the middle? Have you thought about the non-extremes? And the answer is normally no, because that's not who I am as a person, I think. But I think that also, like, you can be parts of structures that you critique and also be in, like, that was counterintuitive, but
No, it's not.
well, you can be a minimalist and still not like elements of minimalism.
Yeah.
And so for me, it comes in the fashion of, maybe to an extent, I have a traumatized brain, and some things, some relationship like strongholds don't work for me.
Yeah.
Or I have ADHD and I can't focus, and I need all these fidget toys to keep my hands occupied so my brain can focus.
Playing with everything. Okay.
Like, there are structures that are created for people that are not like us, but we still have to exist within them. And so for me, my goal as an adult academic is to demonstrate that, like, nothing is normal. There is no normal happening here. And if it is, it's probably false and gives you very little closure.
Yeah.
So do whatever the fuck makes you happy and brings you some kind of joy. Please experience joy. And do that. And who gives a fuck about the other shit? Like, I really am not interested in perpetuating structures that have harmed people for our entire history, or at least from the moment America was made forward. Like, there are things to unpack that we have to do together in a coalition with people that are unlike us, and we do that through diversity and inclusion and understanding and listening, shutting the hell up and listening first. All of these are ways through which we can, true.
Quinian says normal is nothing more or less than the top of the bell curve. Yeah.
It's true.
And it's also like normal is something that is completely socially constructed. So like, I mean, we see this constantly in going from even just state to state, right? What is normal in the South? And we've been talking about this in my interpersonal communication class, right? So what's normal in the South is like very intimate relationships and being that Southern hospitality and like just smiling and saying hello to people and like just doing that because we want people to feel welcome, performative or otherwise. That is something that is normal here in the South. But then you go places like New Jersey, which is where my instructor is from, and she's like, when I first came here, I was like, what the fuck are people doing? And I literally thought the same thing when I went to Boston for the first time. I'm like, why is everyone so angry? And they're not. It's just the normal is not to make eye contact with every single person you encounter on a daily basis. And so this goal in your thesis project to bring sort of that like non-normal recognition and saying like, okay, this group's normal isn't everyone's normal, and like there are people who kind of overlap in normals of two different societies that may have even been contradictory of what normal may be. You see that kind of curve, if you will, double back. And then there's people who would say that this bottom part in between the two is the non-normal behavior, almost the deviant behavior. But there are people who are still like, up here, those
Yeah.
outliers, if you will, that aren't really outliers, right? We kind of see more of a box when it comes to that. And so I think that in your thesis project and in your academic like direction of just saying like, guys, we've got to be more critical of these movements, and it's okay to participate in them and not be fully committed to them, or I don't even think that's the right word, but just not being fully by the rules of all these things that are around us is completely normal. Like that modification process and that critical process, like you creating space of that conversation, even if right now it's through that minimalist movement, I know long term that conversation will change, it will grow, and it will look very different. And I think it's really, really important that people like you can come out here and say that and be able to just say like, I don't have to love every aspect of this thing that I kind of like.
Yeah.
And in fact, I'm always going to have a critical eye of the things that I'm around, and I'm not afraid to have that conversation. And I think that takes a lot because we don't get to have that perspective a lot of the times, and a lot of people reject that conversation regularly.
Yeah.
So Froggy says that normal is personal. It is not a true standard to hold society to. My normal is mine because it is what I do day to day. But because my life is my own and not anyone else's, it is not able to be a standard by which to look at others and make judgment about their lives. And that's important.
Yeah, I agree with that. Also, like, normal is harmful. Like, I don't think that we talk about the fact that, like, the American dream is a really nice idea to people who had opportunities, like our parents or the parents of them. Like,
Yeah.
to me, the American dream is not, yes.
Yeah.
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 The American dream is what would be considered like normal to society. Like, we are expected as women to want to have children and be married and, you know, have the white picket fence and the dog and the 2.5 kids or whatever.
Yeah.
That's normal. That's the societal normal. But to me, like, normal is not wanting any of that and wanting to be a part of a counterculture and enacting. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Thank you, Gwenian. Yes.
Which we don't do here. So I think that for me, my day-to-day task in my own academic life is to expose the normal and create space for the non-normal. Like, and that's what rhetoric, I think, at its heart, to an extent, wants to do. At least modern rhetoric.
Yeah.
Not historically, where we're like studying presidents and shit. Like, that was important in its time. Now we're at a moment where we have to look at the impacts of power and relationships and coalition building.
Yeah.
And structures that are oppressive. And then as scholars, it's our job to like sort of make sense of those things. So for me, I don't expect to change the world. I have no intentions to. I'm probably the worst, most unqualified person to do that.
We're all qualified in our own ways.
No, I don't want to be part of that. I just want to like write a book somewhere and be alone.
Yeah.
I think that all of those things, if the structure doesn't feel right, don't do the structure. And I think that's a sentiment that I would like for people to kind of think about is we're not all the same. The structures are not going to be the same in terms of how it feels and the pressure that it builds on us. So try to find like the things that bring you joy and make you happy and make you feel content or fulfilled, and then do that until you die. Like, whatever that is, regardless of the change or continuation of it, do that, because capitalism is not going to make you feel great. Like, you might have money in the bank, you might have a nice house, you might live in a private area in a really nice town full of institutions of capitalist success, but if those are not your goals and the things that bring you joy, not in a Marie Kondo way, but in like a fulfilling, you know, almost spiritual fashion, like that, there's nothing. You can't take any of this shit with you when you die. So why would you put all of those moments where you could have joy or happiness or content or coalition or whatever, have all of those moments poured into, I need to get this job that makes a lot of money, or I need to do this thing that makes me feel prestigious.
And I want to counter that a little bit and say, like, again, capitalism isn't the absolute worst thing on the planet. Like, we have benefited by being in a capitalist society to a degree. And I think that if that's your goal, go for it. Like if your goal is to have a great job and to be able to buy the things that you want to buy and to be able to travel to the places you want to travel and to be that person, that's incredible. And if that's what brings you joy, go for it. I think that that's the big takeaway here is like it's fine if that's who you are. It's fine if being a minimalist is who you are. It's fine if being the social justice warrior is who you are. It's fine if not being the social justice warrior is who you are. As long as it brings you joy and you're not harming other people and you are doing the thing that makes you feel like a productive member of society is good. And I think that you should be doing the best that you can to do those things.
That's true.
So with that note, I want to say thank you for coming on here because again, this looks very different than last week's podcast. We're very different people. One, I'm really happy people are engaging in the chat. This is it really makes things helpful whenever we can have conversations with you all as well. So with that said, I'm going to say a few notes, but if you have any questions specifically for Gabby or myself, please let us know in the chat those questions. We're going to kind of try and wrap things around an ending here. If you missed last week's podcast, I did just go ahead and decide to make a Twitter account for this podcast, and I would also like to let you know that I made a YouTube channel where I can post the recorded live podcast. So Academic Yak on YouTube. Go back, watch the first episode if you missed it. We had a great time kicking things off. This one will be uploaded shortly, either this evening or tomorrow, so that you can go back and watch it. You're welcome to leave comments and YouTube as well. And then on Twitter, you can find us at yak_pod on Twitter. It was automatically made that way. I don't know what happened with that. But yakpod on Twitter, Academic Yak on YouTube, and of course here on Twitch. We will have another episode on Friday. A really good friend of mine, Isaac, is going to be joining us on Friday at 8 p.m. He is getting his master's in electrical engineering. So if you'd like to kind of flip the switch real quick to a completely different content area, we would love to see you on Friday. He is very excited to join us. I'm very excited to have him. I've really enjoyed having you on here today. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon, evening with me. I have a paper to write. I know you've got some things to do, so we're gonna pop off here. I didn't see any questions come in, but thank you, chat, for hanging out with us. We really appreciated you being here. Shout out to our parents for joining us in the chat. We've seen you guys off and on throughout, so thank you for being here and supporting us. Thank you to my wonderful husband who's behind the scenes here helping us get things running smoothly and keeping things going, and I hope that we can see you on Friday.
Yep. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick. You can turn it off now.